Alrighty, folks, Unit 8. I'm going to get right after it here. There's going to be an FDR video. There's going to be a Truman video. There's going to be an Eisenhower video. That may go a little bit out of order in the study guide here and there, but that's what we're going to try and pull off. We're going to knock straight into it. Front page, big chart, talking about the difference between American foreign policy really leading up to World War II and what it becomes after that. The chart outlines the idea that we're either isolationist or we're interventionist, or some people might even use the word internationalist. American foreign policy here is going to take towards the isolationist strain. Remember, we get out of World War I, we don't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world. We are done. We are not about that life. To borrow the lingo of the kids, that's a phrase they're using. We're not about that life, in case you didn't know. Okay, the NIE Committee is a group that decides that the reason we got involved with World War I was because of a group called Merchants of Death. And these Merchants of Death were individuals who sold guns and ammo, and they also made loans to belligerents and really were interested in making sure that we ended up helping the right side win the war and that they made a lot of money. With that idea, we passed two laws, the Neutrality Acts, to try and keep ourselves out of war. The Neutrality Act in 1935 said you can't sell goods, war material especially, to belligerent nations in the midst of a war. The one in 36 said you can't loan them money. We're trying to learn from our mistakes, right? Those are the things that got us involved in World War I. Give us some props. We're learning. In 1937, we kind of retreat from that a little bit. With the 1937 cash and carry deal, we'll sell you things, but we just can't bring it to you, right? Because we're afraid that if our ship gets sunk, people are going to be like, war, war, war. So you have to come here, you have to pay cash, you have to take it home on your boat. Okay, it's like going to Costco. You have to go to the store, you have to buy a whole bunch of stuff, take it home. Enjoy it at your own place. The destroyer deal. Once the war does begin in Europe, it's very clear that our allies, the people that we're going to support, the British, the French, later on the Soviet Union and the Chinese, they may not be able to pay cash and carry. They certainly can't get here. They may not even be able to pay cash. So we have to get kind of crafty. The first sign of craftiness is what we call the destroyer deal. Roosevelt trades 50 old U.S. destroyers for the rights to build bases on British possessions. Did they buy it? They didn't really have to pay cash. They didn't have to carry it either. Well played, Mr. Roosevelt. Well played. Okay. We then move on to Lend-Lease, which is the granddaddy of all plans, right? Stalin once said that this right here was the reason that the war was won. Now, after the war, if we'd have said that to him, he'd be like, no, no, my friend, it was 27 million Soviet citizens. Do not make it up. Okay? In Mother Russia, well, in Mother Russia, you invade the Crimea, so that's a different story for another day. Okay, so Lend-Lease is a program where we're going to allow the Congress and the government to give goods, whether they be war material or not, to any country whose interests are similar to our own. This is an attempt to make sure that the side that we're in favor of doesn't lose the war. Over $50 billion in Lend-Lease aid is given out over the course of the war. It's massive, massive, okay, in the amount of help that it gives. Soon after that, Roosevelt meets with Winston Churchill to talk about what's called the Atlantic Charter. The charter outlines what the world will look like after the war. After the war. When we win. Now keep in mind, we're not even in the war at this point, but that's the way we roll. We're thinking about after the war. 3-4 steps ahead. That's America. Okay? By the summer of 1941, although we're not in World War I, American ships and German ships are trading fire on the North Atlantic, and it is getting pretty hectic. Okay? Not until the Japanese invasion in December of 1941 do we actually get into the war, but at that point we were sort of inching our way towards it. The Japanese had tried to take more and more territory in Asia, and being a nation that is completely without a lot of resources that you need for war, such as scrap iron, fuel, rubber, they either had to conquer territories that had those materials, or they had to buy them from us. For a long time, we bought them from us. And then eventually we said, no, we're not going to sell you anything else if you're going to act like that. They got all feisty about it, and eventually they invaded Pearl Harbor. The American First Committee is a group of Americans, prominent Americans, who believe that getting involved with the war is a bad idea. They think that this is just going to be another instance of America going down the tubes, and we should stay out of it. Flipping the page, how do we pay for World War II? Now, in World War I, we could say to the American people, get your piggy banks, people, pay your taxes, and buy some war bonds. World War II cost us $330 billion. Okay, that's a big number. we can't depend on the American people to pay that much money. So we're going to have to introduce a new way of paying things, and that's deficit spending. We're basically going to be borrowing that money. Now, we're also going to increase taxes, right? During the height of World War II, the highest American tax rate was 94%. Everyone who's upset at the president should look at that for a moment and be like, well, I guess it's not that bad. 94%. Okay. We also did what we did in World War II, or World War I, I beg your pardon, which was create government agencies, bureaucracies, in order to meet the war means. Running down the list here, the Office of Price Administration. What do you need to know? They rationed. We didn't do that in World War I. In World War I, it was volunteer activity. But that was really a one-year war. This is a long struggle. We're going to ration important goods, meat products, eggs, flours, in some cases sugar. Later on, that's not true. Okay? In order to make sure that you don't end up with a whole bunch of people just taking all the resources and there's nothing left for the soldiers. WPA, or which should be the WPB if you remember correctly on your study guide. The War Production Board is in charge of producing all of the tanks and the jeeps and the guns and the things that go into the war. The National War Labor Board is supposed to be organizing to make sure there's no strikes, which there were thousands of. This is much different from World War I, when there were really no significant strikes. In World War II, huge strikes, which means that there's going to be a lot of anger against labor unions over time. The FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, is there to assure that we give defense industry jobs to minorities. If you think about it, any defense industry job, whether you're working for McDonnell Douglas or Boeing or Ford, that's really a government job. You should be able to get that job regardless of your background. It shouldn't make a difference that you're an African American. It shouldn't make a difference if you're Hispanic. Those are jobs that are being funded by the American people. The OWI, the Office of War Information, kind of like the CPI from World War I, but interested in making sure that you know what the enemy looks like. Remember those sinister-looking posters we saw? This is the enemy. Freaky. Okay? Role of women in the war. A couple big ones. Number one, factory work. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter. About 36% of the nation's industrial workforce was married, was women, and a lot of them were married. That's something that's very new for us here, is seeing married women in the workplace. Hadn't had that in a while. Okay. Also, we see a lot of volunteer women. We see people joining groups called the Waves and the WACs and the SPARs, all of them not in combat roles, but helping to aid the war effort. About 300,000 women there. A. Philip Randolph is a civil rights activist who's part of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he pushes Franklin Roosevelt on the issue of desegregating the defense industry jobs, and Roosevelt creates the FEPC in order to avoid this massive march, what would have been the 1940s equivalent of the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. The GI Bill of Rights is huge, instrumental in assuring that the world has a larger middle class, or at least that we in the United States have a larger middle class. It sends GIs or veterans off to college. It helps them start new businesses. It buys them their first home. It does a lot of things that people from backgrounds that perhaps were not middle class in the past, maybe they're working class, perhaps they're impoverished. Those people wouldn't have thought about those options before, but this is our way of sort of ramping up America. Zoot Suit riots, benefits to California. 1 in 10 government dollars were spent in California during the war. It's a long way from Hitler, and it's far enough from Japan. California is the perfect spot, and that's why we live here today. Yeah, California. All right. Okay, Zoot Suit riots. Hostilities between Hispanic groups, gangs called Pachuco gangs, and also American servicemen centered around violence towards civilians, but it was also about these zoot suits, and I showed you pictures of the zoot suits in class, but for a while those were banned, and the idea was trying to limit opposition in the United States. It was seen as unpatriotic to wear them. Japanese internment, though, should take center stage here. Japanese internment is really the big blight on the civil liberties of the United States. Consider that we didn't intern the Germans, and consider that Japanese Americans in the most populous Japanese American state or territory at the time, Hawaii, were not interned. But along the west coast of the United States, if you're a Japanese American, even students here at Bakersfield High School were taken to internment camps where they stayed for the remainder of the war. Roosevelt thought that this was best in order to assure that there would not be any sort of possibility, if a Japanese invasion took place, of Japanese civilians turning against Americans. Okay. We're going to talk about the war conferences here for a minute as we continue to talk Franklin Roosevelt, and then we're going to shut down Roosevelt in a few minutes. But at Tehran, the first of the war conferences, the issue is the Second Front. Stalin has now been in the war really on his own for about 2 years. He has been holding off the brunt of Hitler's army to the cost of 20 million Soviet individuals. Now, part of that is because the Soviet Union doesn't mind sending out civilians with cardboard cutouts of weapons in order to look like a soldier. Part of it also is that the Soviets never really choose where they fight. Americans got to choose where we attacked, when we attacked, and how we went about it. Hitler did not ask Stalin when he invaded in June of 1941. He showed up, and the Soviets started fighting. As a result of that, the Soviets are not really able to control their own death tolls in the war. America has a much lower death toll, and Stalin is quick to remind us that if we don't get a second front going, it might appear as though we Americans are letting the Soviets and the Nazis kill each other because we don't care about either of them. Yalta. Yalta happens as the war is beginning to wind down, February of 1945. By this point, Roosevelt is really on his last months of life. The big issues at Yalta are now what to do with the world now that we have or are about to win the war. Some significant issues. A Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Stalin is demanding that there is some protection of his empire from the invading Germans in Eastern Europe. We believe that this is okay, but we also force Stalin to admit that he will have elections in those states and that those elections will be free and uninhibited. Yeah, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, not. Okay. Also, we're going to divide Germany into 4 zones among the victorious allies: the British, the Soviet Union, the Americans, and the French. Victorious allies. Okay. We're also going to create a United Nations. Stalin is cheeky enough to say, hey, I want some reparations. The Germans should have to pay me for the war. Right. When he isn't given them, he takes his own reparations and steals everything he can find within conquered portions of Eastern Europe. Well done, Stalin. You're a real man. Okay. But the war is winding down here, and Franklin Roosevelt, unfortunately, is soon to be passing away. He's going to die in April of 1945, having served longer than any American president, and having really endured 2 major crises. You've got the Great Depression and the New Deal following it, and then World War II. When you rank presidents, Roosevelt always gets up into the top 5, and it's because, frankly, he has so many crises to deal with. Generally, Abraham Lincoln gets that top spot, and I think that's the way it should be. But you got to give Roosevelt one of those top 5 spots as a top president. Okay, he's no William Henry Harrison, right? William Henry Harrison was in there for a month. Roosevelt was like, let's get cozy. Hope you're having a good day, folks. The next one will be about President Truman. Take care.